How could 1984 give Hollywood Ghostbusters, Beverly Hills Cop, and Indiana Jones, while also producing some of the most expensive disasters of the decade? Studios threw huge money at famous actors, superheroes, science fiction epics, and prestige directors, believing audiences would automatically show up. They didn't. Some films barely recovered half their budgets. If you enjoy forgotten Hollywood stories and spectacular box office mistakes, hit like and share and subscribe to the channel, because some of these 1984 disasters are almost unbelievable today. Number 17. Falling in Love. On paper, putting Robert De Niro and Meryl Streep together sounded almost impossible to mess up. Both were already respected performers, and Paramount gave their quiet romantic drama a reported budget of around $12 million. Yet the domestic box office reached only about $11.1 million, a disappointing result before theater shares and promotional expenses were even considered. Instead of giving audiences a huge dramatic event, the story follows two ordinary married people, Frank Raftis and Molly Gilmore, whose lives cross during Christmas shopping in Manhattan. A mix-up involving their purchases leads to repeated meetings, and soon their innocent conversations become something more complicated. What makes the movie unusual is how little it behaves like a typical Hollywood romance. There are no glamorous mansions or wild adventures. Much of the tension happens on commuter trains, sidewalks, bookstores, and quiet New York streets. Frank and Molly understand that getting closer could damage two families, but separating becomes increasingly difficult. One of the strongest sequences comes when Molly desperately tries to reach Frank before he leaves New York. Racing through heavy rain, she reaches a railroad crossing and nearly collides with an approaching train. She survives, but she misses him. Later, fate brings them together again during another Christmas season. They meet inside the bookstore connected to their first encounter, briefly separate, and eventually reunite aboard a crowded train. The movie was gentle, restrained, and deliberately old-fashioned. That may also explain the commercial problem. Audiences seeing two acting giants on the poster perhaps expected fireworks. What they received was a whisper. Number 16. The Hotel New Hampshire. Imagine selling audiences a movie starring Jodie Foster, Rob Lowe, Beau Bridges, and Nastassja Kinski, then discovering that many people apparently had no idea what kind of movie you were advertising. That was part of the problem surrounding the Hotel New Hampshire. Depending on the estimate used, its budget was roughly $5.5 million to $7.5 million. Yet its domestic theatrical run ended at only about $5.14 million. Rob Lowe later complained that Orion's advertising badly communicated what the film actually was. The story follows the extremely unconventional Barry family, beginning with parents Wynne and Mary and their 5 children. Their lives revolve around a strange dream, opening hotels. What begins in New England eventually carries the family to Vienna, where their lives become even stranger. There are bears, performers, unusual guests, personal tragedies, eccentric romances, and enough tonal shifts to make the viewer wonder whether the story is a comedy, family drama, fantasy, or something darker. One of its most memorable visual ideas involves a performer disguised as a bear. Another recurring element is the phrase about continuing to pass the open windows, which becomes a symbol for surviving terrible moments rather than surrendering to them. That unusual mixture later earned the movie Defenders, but it was difficult to sell in 1984. Even Lowe admitted it was not really designed for a mass audience. The result was a movie packed with young stars who would become enormously famous, playing to theaters that remained surprisingly empty. If you remember seeing either of these movies during their original theatrical runs, tell us in the comments what the audience reaction was like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now and join us for more forgotten Hollywood successes, disasters, and unbelievable behind-the-scenes stories. Number 15. Electric Dreams. Years before movies became obsessed with artificial intelligence falling in love with humans, this strange little 1984 experiment had already gone there. Its reported budget was about $5.5 million, while theatrical revenue was only around $2.5 million. That made Electric Dreams a commercial disappointment, even though its soundtrack would achieve considerably more recognition than the movie itself. At the center is Miles Harding, an awkward architect who purchases a home computer. After an accident involving liquid and an overloaded system, the machine develops something resembling intelligence and personality. Calling itself Edgar, the computer begins learning about human behavior. Things become much more interesting when Miles meets his neighbor Madeline, a beautiful cellist. Soon Edgar hears Madeline playing music through the wall. Instead of simply processing sounds, the machine responds musically, A strange duet develops between the cellist and the computer, producing one of the film's most memorable sequences. Then Edgar falls for her too. Suddenly Miles is competing with his own computer for the same woman. The premise was remarkably forward-looking, but audiences in 1984 may not have known what to make of it. It looked partly like a romantic comedy, partly like a music video, and partly like speculative science fiction. Director Steve Barron had extensive music video experience, and the movie often feels like an extended piece of glossy 1980s pop culture. Giorgio Moroder's music strengthens that atmosphere. The film disappeared quickly from theaters, yet its central idea aged better than its box office. Decades later, the thought of technology developing emotional attachment does not seem ridiculous at all. In that sense, audiences rejected a movie about the future before realizing how close that future might become. Number 14. Garbo Talks. Sometimes an excellent filmmaker, respected actors, and an emotional premise still cannot convince audiences to buy tickets. Sidney Lumet directed Garbo Talks. Anne Bancroft led the cast. Carrie Fisher appeared in a supporting role, and yet the movie earned only about $1.49 million theatrically. Contemporary reaction was mixed, making it one of Lumet's less commercially visible pictures. The story begins with Estelle Rolfe, an outspoken woman who learns that she is seriously ill. Faced with limited time, she reveals one great wish. She wants to meet Greta Garbo. There is one problem. Garbo had become one of the world's most famous recluses. Estelle's devoted son Gilbert decides that the request is not impossible. He begins searching New York for anyone who might lead him to Garbo. What starts as a loving mission gradually consumes his life. He neglects work, spends money recklessly, and puts pressure on his marriage. That gives the film an interesting emotional twist. Gilbert believes he is helping his mother, but fulfilling her dream forces him to reconsider his own life. Naturally, the entire movie builds toward the moment audiences expect from the title. The most important scene occurs when Garbo finally reaches Estelle's bedside. The film cleverly avoids turning the legendary star into a conventional celebrity cameo. Instead, the meeting is treated almost like the arrival of a mythical figure. It is sweet, odd, and sentimental. But sweetness was not enough at the box office. Number 13. The Lonely Guy. Steve Martin entered 1984 as one of America's most recognizable comedy stars, which made the weak performance of The Lonely Guy particularly noticeable. The movie finished with only about $5.72 million domestically, and contemporary trade reporting described its box office results as disappointing. Martin plays Larry Hubbard, a greeting card writer who discovers his girlfriend with another man. Suddenly homeless, heartbroken, and completely lost, Larry enters what the film imagines as an entire secret society of lonely men. He meets Warren, played brilliantly by Charles Grodin, who becomes his guide to loneliness. From there, the movie turns isolation into absurd comedy. Restaurants somehow seem designed to humiliate anyone asking for a table for one. Apartments become depressing little kingdoms. Dating feels impossible. Even ordinary public spaces remind Larry that everyone else apparently has someone. Eventually, he writes a book called A Guide for the Lonely Guy, and his misery unexpectedly makes him famous. One especially memorable sequence has Larry racing across New York, believing he must stop a wedding, only to burst into the wrong ceremony. The joke captures everything the film wants to say. Even when this man finally decides to act boldly, fate sends him to the wrong room. There are funny ideas scattered everywhere, but critics felt the movie never became the Steve Martin showcase audiences expected. That probably hurt commercially. During an era when comedies such as Ghostbusters were becoming giant theatrical events, The Lonely Guy felt deliberately small and melancholy. Ironically, a movie about loneliness experienced something similar in theaters. Not enough people came to keep it company. Number 12. American Dreamer. This should have been an easy sell. Paris, romance, mystery, mistaken identity, and Jo Beth Williams, coming directly from a period of major Hollywood visibility. Instead, American Dreamer reportedly cost around $10 million and earned only about $5 million in North America. Director Rick Rosenthal later suggested Warner Brothers struggled to figure out how to market it. The premise is wonderfully strange. Kathy Palmer is an ordinary American housewife who enters a writing contest involving her favorite fictional detective, Rebecca Ryan. Kathy wins a trip to Paris, but soon suffers an accident that leaves her confused about her own identity. When she wakes up, she believes she actually is Rebecca Ryan. Instead of panicking, Kathy begins behaving like the fearless heroine from the novels. She dresses differently, enters dangerous situations without hesitation, and approaches real people as though they are characters inside one of her mystery stories. Tom Conti plays the confused man drawn into her adventure, while the streets and hotels of Paris turn into Kathy's personal espionage playground. The fun comes from watching an ordinary suburban woman suddenly develop extraordinary confidence because she no longer remembers she is supposed to be ordinary. Chases through Paris and Kathy's fearless confrontations provide the movie's most memorable moments. Unfortunately, another romantic adventure had already exploded earlier that year, Romancing the Stone. The similarities probably did American Dreamer no favors. One movie became an enormous hit. The other arrived months later looking like a smaller cousin. Its commercial failure was especially frustrating because Rosenthal claimed audiences who actually saw it responded well. Hollywood's problem was not necessarily making the movie. It was convincing people to enter the theater. Number 11. Best Defense. Here is where 1984 Hollywood panic becomes almost comical. Best Defense reportedly cost about $18 million and earned around $19.3 million domestically. That sounds respectable until theater revenue sharing and promotional costs enter the equation. More importantly, the studio had expected far more from a movie advertised around one of the hottest comedians in America, Eddie Murphy. There was an even bigger problem. Murphy was not originally supposed to be in the film. The main story follows Dudley Moore as Wiley Cooper, an engineer working on a guidance system for a military tank. His technical problems, corporate troubles, and questionable decisions form the central comedy. Preview audiences reportedly reacted poorly. Paramount then made an extraordinary decision: add Eddie Murphy. New material was filmed showing Murphy as Lieutenant T.M. Landry, an American tank commander operating years later. The tank he is driving contains the technology developed in Moore's storyline. That creates perhaps the movie's most famous oddity. Moore and Murphy are the stars on the poster, yet their main characters essentially occupy different stories and never properly team up. Murphy's tank sequences were meant to inject energy into a movie the studio feared was already in trouble. Instead, the finished product often feels like two separate films being switched back and forth. Audiences noticed. The opening weekend was fairly strong, around $7.9 million, but business fell sharply afterward. It became a warning about desperate studio repairs. Adding a superstar may sell the opening weekend. It cannot automatically repair the movie around him. Number 10. Streets of Fire. Very few financial disappointments look this cool. Walter Hill described Streets of Fire as a rock and roll fable, blending 1950s style, 1980s music, comic book action, motorcycles, neon lights, and a city that seems to exist outside normal time. Universal reportedly spent around $14.5 million making it. Domestic receipts reached only about $8.1 million. Plans for further adventures involving hero Tom Cody disappeared with the disappointing theatrical performance. Everything begins during a concert. Rock singer Ellen Aim, played by Diane Lane, is performing when the motorcycle gang known as the Bombers storms the venue and carries her away. Her former boyfriend Tom Cody returns to town and reluctantly agrees to rescue her. That simple rescue story becomes an explosion of rain, fire, motorcycles, leather jackets, music, and exaggerated characters. Willem Dafoe's Raven Shattuck is unforgettable because he looks as though he walked directly out of a nightmare version of a 1950s street gang. And the movie's signature confrontation does not involve futuristic weapons. Cody and Raven face one another with enormous sledgehammers. The duel is rough, theatrical, and completely consistent with the strange universe Hill created. Unfortunately, audiences did not embrace that universe. Perhaps the problem was marketing. Was it a musical, an action movie, a romance, a fantasy, a biker film? The answer was basically yes to everything. Today, that mixture is exactly why the movie has passionate fans. In 1984, however, being difficult to categorize could be expensive. Number 9. The Razor's Edge. Imagine leaving a movie like Ghostbusters and discovering that one of its stars had used his Hollywood power to make almost the complete opposite kind of film. That was Bill Murray's The Razor's Edge. The production cost roughly $12 minus $13 million, while theatrical revenue reached only about $6.6 million. It was considered a commercial failure. Instead of playing another sarcastic comedian, Murray portrays Larry Darrell, a man returning from the First World War, emotionally changed by everything he has experienced. Larry's wealthy friends expect him to settle into a comfortable life. He refuses. Searching for meaning, he travels through Europe, works among ordinary laborers, and eventually journeys toward India and the Himalayas. The story becomes less about external adventure and more about a man asking what a worthwhile life actually means. That seriousness surprised audiences familiar with Murray's comedy. One memorable section follows Larry into the mountains, where isolation and spiritual study finally give him some of the peace he has been seeking. Another deeply personal moment involves Larry remembering a wartime companion. Murray and director John Byram worked elements inspired by Murray's late friend John Belushi into the emotional material surrounding the character's wartime experiences. The strangest part of the story happened behind the scenes. Murray wanted the film made badly enough that his participation in Ghostbusters became connected to Columbia, agreeing to support the Razor's Edge. One movie became a cultural phenomenon. The other disappeared. That contrast could hardly have been more brutal. Audiences happily paid to watch Murray chase ghosts. Far fewer wanted to watch him search for enlightenment. Number 8. Songwriter. Sometimes a movie can receive an Academy Award nomination and still barely sell tickets. Songwriter reportedly cost approximately $8.6 million, but earned only around $866,000 domestically. One of the harshest budget-to-gross ratios on this entire list. That is remarkable, because the cast included Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson, two performers with enormous recognition in country music. Nelson plays Doc Jenkins, a successful songwriter who has somehow lost control of the business surrounding his own music. Contracts, managers, ownership, debts, and poor decisions have left him watching other people profit from songs he created. Chris Christopherson plays Blackie Buck, his old musical partner and friend. Their relationship becomes the heart of the story. Rather than presenting country musicians as glamorous celebrities, the movie focuses on the strange business machinery behind the songs. Publishers, deals, managers, touring, ownership, and performers trying to reclaim control of their work. Concert and recording sequences are naturally among the movie's highlights because Nelson and Christopherson instantly look comfortable whenever music takes over. The production itself encountered trouble. Original director Steve Rash was removed after filming had already begun, and Alan Rudolph took over. The interruption reportedly added around $1.5 million to production expenses. The finished film received some positive notices and even earned an Oscar nomination for its music. Ticket buyers still stayed away. That made the movie's subject strangely appropriate. Here was a story about talented musicians discovering that artistic success and financial success are not the same thing. Then the film itself learned exactly the same lesson. Number 7. The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai, Across the Eighth Dimension. Try explaining this movie to someone who has never heard of it. Buckaroo Banzai is a neurosurgeon. He is also a physicist. He is also a rock musician. He is also a test driver. And he has to stop interdimensional aliens. That glorious madness reportedly cost around $17 million, but North American revenue reached only about $6.3 million. It recovered far less than its production cost theatrically, and later became one of the classic examples of a box office failure, developing a devoted cult audience. The opening tells you immediately what kind of movie you are watching. Buckaroo climbs into an experimental rocket-powered car and drives directly toward a mountain. Instead of crashing, he activates technology that allows the vehicle to pass through solid matter and enter another dimension. When he emerges, he has unintentionally created a doorway to much bigger trouble. The villains are red lectroids from Planet 10, led on Earth by the wonderfully excessive Dr. Emilio Lizardo, played by John Lithgow. From there, the story barely slows down. There are aliens disguised as humans, bizarre scientific equipment, musical performances, government secrets, eccentric heroes known as the Hong Kong Cavaliers, and dialogue delivered as if audiences already watched 5 previous Buckaroo Banzai movies. That may have been the commercial problem. The film throws viewers into an already fully developed universe and expects them to keep up. Today, audiences familiar with massive cinematic universes might understand the approach immediately. In 1984, many were simply confused. Its planned sequel never materialized, yet the very qualities that frightened ordinary ticket buyers created its cult reputation. Hollywood wanted a franchise. Instead, it created a secret handshake among science fiction fans. Number 6. Rhinestone. What happens when you take Sylvester Stallone at nearly the height of his action star fame and decide the audience really wants to hear him sing country music? Hollywood found out the expensive way. Rhinestone carried a reported budget of approximately $28 million and earned about $21.4 million domestically. It was widely regarded as a commercial and critical disappointment. The story begins with country singer Jake Ferris, played by Dolly Parton. She makes an outrageous bet with her manager. Give her almost any ordinary man, and she can transform him into a believable country singer. The man selected is Nick Martinelli, a loud New York taxi driver played by Stallone. There is just one major problem. Nick cannot sing country music. At least not convincingly. Jake drags him into a completely unfamiliar world, teaching him clothes, manners, music, stage presence, and the emotional language of country songs. That provides the movie's central joke. One of cinema's toughest-looking stars, desperately attempting to become a country performer. The scene that became infamous rather than celebrated involves Stallone actually singing. His performance of numbers such as Drinkenstein became part of the movie's reputation for years afterward. Dolly Parton, unsurprisingly, seems completely comfortable with the music. Stallone looks like a man fighting an entirely different kind of opponent. Number 5. The Bounty. Unlike many films on this list, The Bounty was not dismissed as an obviously bad movie. That makes its commercial disappointment much more interesting. The lavish historical drama cost roughly $20 minus $25 million depending on the reported figure. It earned only about $8.6 million in the United States and Canada, while reported worldwide theatrical rentals were about $18.3 million. And look at the cast. Anthony Hopkins plays Lieutenant William Bligh. Mel Gibson plays Fletcher Christian. Daniel Day-Lewis appears as John Fryer. Liam Neeson is Charles Churchill. Laurence Olivier portrays Admiral Hood. On talent alone, it sounds unstoppable. The film retells the famous mutiny aboard HMS Bounty, but instead of presenting Bligh as a simple monster and Christian as a perfect hero, the story makes their relationship more complicated. Early in the voyage, Bligh and Christian share genuine trust. That bond begins collapsing after the crew reaches Tahiti. The island offers warmth, freedom, relationships, and a completely different life from the discipline aboard a British naval vessel. Leaving becomes unbearable for some men. Bligh's attempts to restore strict order only increase resentment. The central mutiny scene is naturally the moment everything has been building toward. Christian finally turns against his commander, and Bligh is forced into a small launch with loyal crew members. There is no giant Hollywood victory. Instead, the film presents two men whose friendship has collapsed into one of maritime history's most famous conflicts. Critics often respected the realism in Hopkins's performance, but respect did not create a blockbuster. Perhaps audiences had already seen the Bounty story enough times. Perhaps the serious tone worked against it. Whatever the reason, one of the strongest casts assembled in 1984 sailed straight into a financial storm. Number 4. Dune. Before Denis Villeneuve turned Dune into a modern blockbuster franchise, Hollywood had already learned how dangerous Frank Herbert's universe could be. David Lynch's 1984 adaptation carried an estimated production budget of around $40 minus $42 million, enormous for the period. Its North American gross finished at roughly $31 million, and contemporary accounts treated the expensive production as a major box office disappointment. The story is massive. Young Paul Atreides travels with his family to Arrakis, the desert planet that produces the most valuable substance in the universe, spice. Control of Arrakis means enormous political and economic power, but the transfer is a trap. House Harkonnen attacks, Paul's family is destroyed, and Paul escapes into the desert with his mother Jessica. There he encounters the Fremen. Slowly, the sheltered nobleman becomes something entirely different. Warrior, religious symbol, political leader, and possible fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. None of that is easy material to explain in a couple of hours. The film practically attacks the viewer with names, factions, planets, internal thoughts, political schemes, prophecies, special terminology, and strange technology. Yet it also contains images no one forgot. The sandworms remain the movie's greatest spectacle. When Paul finally rides one of the gigantic creatures across the desert, Lynch briefly delivers the enormous mythic adventure audiences had been promised. The problem was everything surrounding those moments. Universal wanted an accessible science fiction event. Lynch had material dense enough for several movies. The theatrical version was cut down, and the result confused many viewers while frustrating devotees of Herbert's novel. Even Lynch later distanced himself from versions over which he lacked final control. Commercially, the timing was unforgiving too. It opened in December against Beverly Hills Cop, which was becoming a phenomenon. So while Eddie Murphy dominated multiplexes with a simple fish-out-of-water comedy, audiences entering Dune needed to understand Mentats, Bene Gesserit, spice, Fremen, Harkonnens, Atreides politics, and giant worms. Number 3. Sheena. Columbia clearly hoped it had a glamorous new adventure heroine. Instead, Sheena became one of 1984's clearest financial failures. The production reportedly cost about $25 million and grossed less than $6 million. with Box Office Mojo recording roughly $5.78 million domestically. Tanya Roberts plays Janet Ames, an orphan raised in the fictional African kingdom of Tigora after her parents die during an expedition. Adopted by a local spiritual woman, Janet becomes Sheena, a protector of the land who possesses an unusual ability to communicate telepathically with animals. That gives the movie its biggest visual hook. Sheena does not need conventional transportation. Animals respond to her. She rides through enormous landscapes, surrounded by wildlife, and becomes involved in a struggle over the future of the kingdom. The plot becomes more complicated when journalist Vic Casey arrives and gets pulled into political conflict involving the country's leadership and valuable natural resources. Visually, the movie wants to feel enormous. Unfortunately, spectacle could not overcome the reaction to the script. Critics were extremely harsh, and audiences quickly disappeared. That $25 million price tag made the result especially painful. Number 2. Supergirl. This was supposed to prove that the Superman universe could survive without Superman. Instead, it became one of the most infamous superhero disappointments of the decade. The American Film Institute notes conflicting contemporary budget reports, including approximately $35 million, and estimates as high as $60 million. The commonly cited $35 million figure alone makes the result painful. North American box office reached only around $14.3 million. Helen Slater plays Kara Zor-El, Superman's cousin. Her adventure begins in Argo City, where a powerful device called the Omegahedron is accidentally lost and travels to Earth. Kara follows it. Selina is an aspiring sorceress who quickly realizes the object can amplify her abilities. Instead of building toward a conflict involving a terrifying cosmic villain, the movie mixes superhero adventure with magic, boarding school comedy, romance, and camp fantasy. Peter O'Toole even appears as Zoltar, the man partly responsible for Kara's original mistake. Some scenes still work surprisingly well visually. Supergirl's early flying sequence presents her almost like a dancer learning what her powers can do. Those graceful images remain among the film's strongest moments. Later, everything becomes much darker when Selina sends Kara into the Phantom Zone. Stripped of her powers, Supergirl must escape the strange prison before returning to Earth for the final confrontation. The climax becomes a full fantasy spectacle, involving storms, magical forces, distorted environments, and Selina's shadow creature. Yet audiences never embrace the mixture. What makes the failure more dramatic is the brand behind it. Christopher Reeve's first Superman had been a landmark blockbuster only 6 years earlier. Producers expected that universe to expand. Instead, Superman 3 disappointed compared with earlier installments. Then Supergirl performed far worse. Number 1. The Cotton Club. At number 1 sits the movie that combined a legendary director, an extraordinary cast, lavish production design, dangerous behind-the-scenes turmoil, and one of 1984's ugliest financial equations. Francis Ford Coppola's The Cotton Club reportedly ballooned to around $58 million. Its North American theatrical gross? Approximately $25.9 million. Contemporary reporting described it as a commercial failure, and concern over the financial impact was serious enough that Orion Pictures' position attracted attention on Wall Street. The movie takes audiences into Harlem during the 1920s and 1930s, centered around the legendary Cotton Club. Richard Gere plays musician Dixie Dwyer, whose relationship with gangster Dutch Schultz pulls him deeper into organized crime. At the same time, Gregory Hines plays Sandman Williams, a brilliant dancer whose professional and romantic story unfolds inside the club's complicated world. Diane Lane, Lonette McKee, Bob Hoskins, James Remar, Nicolas Cage, Lawrence Fishburne, and Fred Gwynne fill out an almost absurdly impressive cast. And visually, the money is everywhere. The clubs glitter. Cars fill period streets. Costumes appear in endless combinations. Dance numbers explode across the stage. Jazz performances recreate a world Hollywood desperately wanted audiences to believe was alive again. One of the movie's greatest sequences crosscuts violent gangster action with a tap dance performance. Instead of treating dance as decoration, Coppola uses rhythm, movement, editing, and tension together, making entertainment inside the club collide with danger outside it. Producer Robert Evans and Coppola later blamed different factors for the production problems. Even the structure of the movie became controversial. Coppola eventually returned decades later to create The Cotton Club Encore, restoring material and giving greater attention to the black performers and musical storyline that had been reduced in the original theatrical version. So which 1984 disaster deserved better? Dune, Streets of Fire, Supergirl, or maybe the completely insane Buckaroo Banzai? Some of these movies eventually found loyal fans, but their original theatrical numbers told a very different story. If you enjoyed this trip through Hollywood's expensive mistakes, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us which year of box office disasters we should investigate next.